pretty straightforward, pretty self-explanatory. That's kind of why we tackle it during the summer. But there's just a lot of it, you know? And so my goal for you is really just to help you manage it and really to help you better understand what to focus in on. And so when we look at A4.2, so there's going to be an entire, kind of group of assessment statements. There's kind of two really big ideas, and that's what is causing our current extinction crisis. And that sounds really alarmist, but to be blunt, that's exactly what it is. We're driving the organisms on the planet to extinction at an alarming rate. And so we actually consider this to be the sixth mass extinction event that's happened on Earth. And it's also referred to as anthropogenic extinction. So we'll talk a little bit about what causes it. We'll talk about some examples of organisms that have already gone extinct. And we'll also talk about some habitats in which, in multiple species are facing extinction, because it's not just a single species that's struggling with extinction. It's an entire ecosystem. And then on the bright side, or on the much brighter side, we'll talk about how we can prevent or help support endangered species, and some of the programs, whether those be volunteer programs or intergovernmental organizations, IGOs or NGOs, that are helping support that. So those are the big kind of overview questions on the conservation of biodiversity. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool. And if you don't like my explanation, I've linked a video in Google Classroom from, I think, a gal who does a really nice job of running down A4.2. And then in addition, I'll also send out a video assignment with like embedded questions that really gets at the heart of what A4.2 is all about. And so that's our goal. Our goal is really just to help you understand, out of all this material, which again, I think is pretty straightforward, what do you really need to focus in on and what do you really need to pay attention to? Because there's a lot of it. But again, what you do need to pay attention to is pretty straightforward. And so I've kind of broken it down into 6 big ideas. And the first one we'll talk about here in a couple seconds, and that's just what is biodiversity. And biodiversity is an abbreviation for biological diversity, but it really has 3 main kind of pillars. And we'll talk about those 3 pillars and how they're different from one another. And then we'll get into how we measure or how we quantify biodiversity using a tool called the Simpson's Diversity Index, and how that relates to species richness and evenness. And then we'll get into anthropogenic extinction. We'll talk about the difference between in situ and ex situ conservation. And then we'll talk a little bit about the EDGE program, which is one of the many strategies that we're using to kind of help preserve animals who are on the brink of or on the edge of extinction. All right. And if at any point, if you are kind of taking notes using this document and there's a blank maybe that's confusing or you don't know what it means, just let me know. The answers are also included to the notes in Google Classroom as well, if that helps. All right, so far so good. Any questions? Should we get into biodiversity?
Yeah, I don't have any.
Oh, perfect. No, you don't think we'll have any surprise guests, like Guyun will drop in, or maybe we'll see Ilya? No surprise. No, Victoria, maybe. So there was no drama on your Thailand trip. Everything went according to plan.
Yeah, I think it went pretty well.
Yeah, nobody got in trouble. Nobody got tattoos.
No.
Oh,
not at all.
You had a crew, right? You had some pretty interesting GSP members going.
I mean, it wasn't bad. Sure, it was a little bit noisy the first few nights, but I think it ended up being pretty well. We were just really competitive. Like the group leaders, or not the group leaders, like the people at the organization were very surprised. We're definitely the most competitive group they've had. but that was
Okay.
it.
Competitive. And what types of things were you competing in?
Anything. I mean, there was kind of like I don't know if you could call it a variation of the game telephone.
Sure.
And there, sure, there was a little bit of like a heated discussion, but it was okay. Like they just learned that we get very into the game when we do those kind of activities, but that's it.
Okay. All right. There you go. And who did you primarily hang out with?
Um, I would say Rosa, Kendall, Anna, Corey,
Oh,
Rebecca, Camilla.
oh, so you had some nice young ladies who went with
Yeah.
you as well. Oh, good. Oh, good, 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 good. All right. So let's talk about the three different types of biodiversity. Do you have any idea or any guesses as to what those three types of biodiversity might be?
Species, genetic, and something else that starts with like bio, I think.
Close, close. Species, genetic, and ecosystem
Oh,
diversity. So you nailed it. You nailed it. When we think biodiversity, usually we think species biodiversity, right? We think about the number of organisms that are out there. But really, genetic and ecosystem biodiversity are also incredibly important. And genetic biodiversity is actually kind of confusing sometimes. So you can have a group of organisms that you have relatively stable numbers in terms of their populations, but really lack a lot of variation within their gene pools. And so then that's leading to a lot of the emergence of recessive genetic disorders. And one example that really pops into my head is cheetahs. You know, cheetahs are a very finicky species. They're a very anxious animal. Um, they are a predator, but have kind of a low success rate in terms of their hunts. So although they're expending all of that energy and moving very quickly, I believe I feel like it's less than 50% of their hunts end in success, and oftentimes that's due to other animals driving them off their prey. So a lion or a hyena will come along, or a jaguar or whatever, and just take whatever the poor cheetah has has successfully hunted. And as we see human populations grow and habitats shrink, these predators come into closer contact with each other more frequently, and so that's really creating some issues for cheetahs. And then they do have some rare genetic disorders that are emerging just because their populations are a little inbred. And so scientists right now are really trying to figure out how to enhance the cheetah's gene pool so that we can keep them healthy and thriving and continuing to reproduce. Have you seen the videos where they'll partner a cheetah up with like a golden retriever?
oh
Um,
yeah, and it's like a friend of some sort.
Yeah, because cheetahs, man, are are pretty close to being domesticated, man. They are not aggressive towards humans. They're kind of like big cats, and so they're an interesting example. But these are the three big groups. So we've got ecosystem diversity, and again, ecosystem diversity is concerning because we have this umbrella that is the ecosystem, and underneath this umbrella we have all sorts of plants and animals, fungi, that are living within this ecosystem. And so if the ecosystem is degraded or destroyed, then that threatens multiple species at the same time. This map, I'll try to make this a little bit bigger. Super fascinating. So what trends do you notice, Maya, when you take a look at this map? What are you seeing here?
Most of the mammals are more like towards South America or
Yeah.
Africa.
Yeah, what line is going to run kind of right through here?
Uh,
What's that line that runs right around the center of the earth?
equator.
Yeah, the equator. So if you look across the equator, right, you see the highest amount of mammal diversity, right? But what's sad is that when we look at upper economically developed countries and lower economically developed countries, most of our lower economically developed countries, which sometimes are referred to as third world countries, are also in this band across the equator. So you've got folks who are relying really heavily on agriculture. They're relying in many cases on persistence hunting. So they're hunting as a food source. It's not recreational. And at the same time, we've got all of these mammals living in these same areas as well. And so perhaps if we saw a huge amount of mammal diversity in Canada or in Northern Europe, we wouldn't be as concerned because industry has developed. People are depending on other things in terms of getting food and what they need. But here, we've got humans who are really just trying to get by. And so, it's really tough to tell someone, hey, you can't hunt or you can't farm because there's an endangered salamander when these people are trying to feed their kids. And so that's really what's accelerating a lot of these biodiversity losses is just humans trying to live. And you can't fault anybody for that. But it is symptomatic of, a population of 8 billion people living on the earth. And so it'll be really interesting to see how these numbers change in the next decade, 20 years, 30 years. And what really needs to happen is we need to get folks, into these areas, helping to support the quality of life and introducing industry and introducing other ways besides agriculture and hunting for these people to survive. And that's happening, but it's happening slowly. We talked about genetic, we talked about ecosystem, we talked about species diversity. Any questions about these three different types of diversity?
Nope.
Nope. All right. Good deal. Good deal. Good deal. And then when we talk about any of these three variations, we're always looking at two different factors, and those two different factors are evenness and richness. So here we have a graphic of some bugs. Have you seen these types of bugs before?
Butterflies and dragonflies.
Yeah, and we got a little ladybug, it looks like right here, and we've got some ants. And so, man, one of these images is going to represent something that's really even, and the other is going to represent something that's really rich. And so the question is, what's the difference? Which one do you think is more even, and which one is more rich?
The first one's more rich and the second one's more even.
You nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. So here we see three species, and so it's slightly more rich, right? But in sample B, we see two species. However, you're a sharp cookie, so you probably have noticed that there's four ants here and four butterflies. Whereas here we've got 5 or 6 monarchs and then one dragonfly and one ladybug. So what's going to happen when this ladybug, finishes college and wants to settle down and have a family? What's going to happen to that poor ladybug?
It's not gonna have anyone to mate with.
It's so sad. It's bringing a tear to my eye. Yeah, so it's not going to have that genetic diversity to go in and have additional ladybugs, right? And so that's really concerning. And so what we want really is a balance of evenness and richness. But when it really comes down to it, we need evenness. We need to have organisms that are able to actually reproduce with another organism. And so you nailed it. Richness is the number of the species present, and evenness is, having similar numbers from one organism to the next. All right. And I think we covered that sample A has a higher richness, but sample B has a higher evenness. So here's kind of a fun fact. We're kind of changing the subject, but we think that there are more species alive today than there have ever been at any point on Earth, which is wild. think about. But that's a really, really, really tough statement to make. And part of the reason why it's so gosh darn tough is because we rely on something called the fossil record to make these kind of statements and these types of conclusions. And the fossil record is basically just the evidence that we've gathered, whether it's due to, trace fossils or fossil imprints or actual fossils like you think of when you go to natural history museums. And the problem, though, is that it's really hard for living things to become fossilized. And so the fossil record is a bit like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, but we have like only 100 pieces, right? So we're trying to get a clear picture of what history on life on Earth looks like, but we just don't have a lot of those puzzle pieces to make an accurate assumption. The good news is there's plenty of evidence that's still out there, and so we may continue, or we will continue to find more evidence that'll help us complete this picture. But the big takeaway is that in terms of biodiversity, this is arguably, we think, the most biodiverse that the Earth has ever been. At times, the Earth has kind of hit the reset switch, and so as I mentioned before, there's been 5 mass extinction events that we've found evidence for, and these mass extinction events, they weren't caused by people. Do you have any guesses as to what might have caused these mass extinction events in the past?
There was one with the dinosaurs and oh my gosh, I forgot the word. The giant rock.
Yeah, comet. Yeah. So
Comet.
we think that maybe a large kind of asteroid, meteorite, comet, I always forget how those are different, might have struck the Earth, and that might have contributed to one of the major extinction events facing the dinosaurs. And then a lot of the other ones, we're pretty confident it was just plain old-fashioned tectonic activity, so volcanic eruptions, right? All around the world, there's these super volcanoes, and they don't go off very often, but we think throughout our history, throughout the millions of years that the Earth has been around, we've seen some super volcanoes erupt, and that's in turn led to some mass extinctions. Have you heard about the super volcano that's in the central United States, kind of under Montana?
Mm-mm.
Oh, there is a super volcano, and that's what leads to a lot of the kind of the tectonic activity in places like Yellowstone National Park. There's this famous thing called Old Faithful. It's geyser, and that's all attributed to the super volcano. And every once in a while, you'll hear a news story about, oh, we think the super volcano is going to erupt, but I think we're okay. It's not due to explode at any time soon. So 5 mass extinction events. You nailed it. An asteroid. So I was wrong. It wasn't a meteor. It wasn't a comet. Caused the most recent one, and that wiped out a lot of our dinosaur friends. And then we think the rest were caused by volcanic activity as the Earth was kind of forming. And you're not required to really know much more than that. However, what we're really focusing in on now is that we're in the midst of this 6th mass extinction, and this 6th mass extinction is caused by you and I, and really within the last, goodness gracious, 200 years, which is really scary, how fast it's happening when you look at the geological record. So how are our notes going? Are we getting all this good stuff?
Yep.
Any blanks that you're unclear on?
Nope.
Okay. So let's take a look now at how humans might be causing extinction. And you can guess, how do you think people, you and I, not you and I, but human society is leading to the extinction of animals? What do you think?
Climate change, habitat loss, pollution.
Yeah.
hunting.
Yeah. Yeah, you nailed it. Do you have to memorize every single cause that the IB outlines? Absolutely not. No, ma'am. What I'd recommend doing is just having 4 or 5 examples like you just named off the top of your head. And I would expect this to be in some sort of a longer question. Maybe something you'd see in part B of a paper 2, where it might just say, can you outline 4 to 5 causes of the anthropogenic extinction currently facing Earth? And I think you nailed so many of these here. Over harvesting. So I think when we think harvest, we think agriculture, right? But that's also fish, that's hunting, that's logging. It's anytime you're taking a natural resource at a faster rate than the earth can replenish itself, that's going to fall into this broad category of over harvesting. And a lot of developed countries, North America, Northern Europe, Western Europe, we've gotten a good handle on our forestry, agricultural, hunting practices. But again, if we think back to that equator in that middle band of these lower economically developed countries, you got folks who are just trying to get food for their children to survive, and they're probably going to be less concerned about overharvesting. And that's where a lot of these species that are being threatened live. And so it's tricky. Habitat destruction, again, pretty gosh darn straightforward. Um, you know, we see it less or at less of an accelerated rate than you would in developing countries, but it still happens in higher economically developed countries. Invasive species, oh my goodness, this is a big one, right? This is essentially, more problematic than a lot of the others because animals are going to do what animals need to do to survive. Plants are going to need to do what plants need to do to survive. They're going to compete. And if they can piggyback on humans, cars, boats, whatever, then suddenly they have access to environments that they can really thrive in, but that comes at a cost of all the organisms that currently live there. You're down in Florida. What invasive species is currently impacting Florida?
I mean, we have a lot of snakes.
Oh, do
Get
you ever? Oh my goodness. Do you know the name of the species of snake in particular that's become so problematic down in the Everglades?
Oh yeah, anaconda.
And well, yeah, and Burmese pythons as well.
Oh
And
yeah.
so um, Burmese pythons can reproduce exponentially. So they're these R strategist organisms that like they basically have as many babies as they can, and then they don't invest any efforts into care of their offspring. So totally different than humans, totally different than elephants, excuse me. Um, but in doing so they flood these ecosystems with babies, and then the babies do quite well. They have a high survival rate, and they eat everything they can find, right? And they
Mhm.
don't have any natural predators. And so what Florida has really started doing is Florida will pay people to go out into the Everglades and kill pythons.
Yeah,
And
but it's hard because they
yeah,
can't go too deep into the dense forests.
yeah, because those snakes get down low into the swamps, right? And you got to dig for them, and they're really hard to detect. And
Mhm.
again, they're reproducing faster than people can hunt them, right? So that's a really big one. There's also a little rodent called a nutria. It kind of looks like a capybara. I don't know if you've seen capybaras from Brazil.
Yeah.
It's like a smaller kind of capybara, but nutrias were introduced from Central and South America, and they're super problematic. And then, oh my goodness, don't even get me started on plants. There's a plant down in Florida and Georgia called kudzu,
Mhm.
and kudzu grows so fast that if you park your car on the street and you go on vacation, you come back a week later, your car will be completely covered in kudzu. You have to like you have to like cut it away, and that's invasive as well. And so, it's not just intentional practices that are leading to this anthropogenic species extinction. It's also unintentional because no one's trying to introduce invasive species. Well, I
Mhm.
take that back. Some people have. Do you know about the meadowlarks?
No.
Or maybe I'm thinking starlings, not meadowlarks. But there was a fella in the United States who wanted to introduce all of the animals featured in Shakespeare's work to North America. And so he brought back, I think it was starlings. He brought starlings back from Europe, and he introduced them to New York because he thought, New York deserves these birds that are written about by Shakespeare. And they've just exploded in numbers and outcompeted tons of other native birds. Gray squirrels, when you see gray squirrels in the UK, those are an invasive species. Beavers in Patagonia, those are an invasive species. And so, we're spreading these guys around all over the place. Pollution is obviously pretty straightforward. That makes sense. And then climate change, which is the big one, right? How's the weather been down in Florida? Have you had any crazy storms?
Uh, well, it's kind of common for Florida to have it just because of
Yeah,
their location,
because
but it has been
are you in the
warm.
Bay?
I'm up in Tampa, so it's
Yeah,
more like,
okay. Yeah, so you get lightning. Holy cow.
yeah, we get it all.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's really problematic as well. So there you go. You've got your sixth extinction event. And down here in our notes, I think we got these right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And booyah. Now, in a question, I don't see this very often, but in a question, occasionally you might be asked to provide an example of a organism that has become extinct due to anthropogenic activities, so human activities. And there are three kind of examples I've given you here, and that's the moas, the Caribbean monk seals, and the Mount Glorious torrent frog. And you don't need to know these animals specifically. These are just examples that I came up with off the top of my head, and I can tell you a little bit about them. So the moa, where do you think a moa is from? Any guesses?
Some kind of island?
It is definitely from an island. Have you ever been to New Zealand?
No.
No? Would you ever want to go to New Zealand?
Yeah.
Yeah. So these moas were in New Zealand, right? And we think the Maori, the New Zealand people, were actually Polynesian. So they were Pacific Islanders who came. I guess I'm trying to think. I guess they would have come east and settled New Zealand, right? And so this is thousands of years ago, right? And they settled on New Zealand, and they found that these moas were pretty tame because they've never seen humans before. They didn't see them as a threat, and they were a really easy food source. And so it didn't take long before the moas were completely driven to extinction. And this is before the Industrial Revolution. This is before factories, and the population was 8 billion people. And so even in early days, we were driving organisms to extinction just because we didn't really have a sense of overhunting. And so that would be one example. So the Maoris, the folks who do the haka dance,
Mhm.
drive these moas to extinction. And then maybe a slightly more recent example would be monk seals. I don't know if you saw this in the news, but a few weeks ago there was a fella in Hawaii, a tourist, who threw a rock at a monk seal's head. Did you catch this at all?
No.
Yeah, it made national news. It was a big deal. So this fella, I don't know where he was from, for no reason whatsoever, picked up a huge rock and threw it at a monk seal, right? And the monk seals are super passive. They're really, really nice seals.
Mhm.
And that's part of the reason why they've struggled in terms of numbers, because they're not overly afraid of people. Um, and so these Hawaiian monk seals are still around, and they're very endangered. But the Hawaiian people take protecting them very, very seriously, and so their numbers have actually like rebounded quite a bit. They're doing okay. However, their cousins in the Caribbean, they were driven to extinction during a lot of the slave trade. So when the Caribbean kind of opened up to trading, and we saw a lot of trade in spices and dyes and obviously slaves. Those sailors needed to eat, and so they drove those Caribbean monk seals to extinction. So that's a slightly more recent example. And again, overhunting was the cause. And then the weirdest one is the Mount Glorious torrent frog. And so these little fellows are from Australia, right? And frogs are very, very sensitive animals in terms of pollution, in terms of habitat loss. And so we usually look, if we want to know about the health of an ecosystem, we usually use frogs as what we call an ecological indicator. Because if there's pollution, the first organisms that are going to show it are going to be the frogs. They live in the water, they breathe through their skin. Pollution hits frogs much harder than it would a mammal or even a fish. Now, these little fellas weren't done in by pollution. What they were done in by was the introduction of pigs to Australia by some native Australians. And a lot of those pigs stayed on the farm, but occasionally pigs broke free, right? And they became feral. And so I didn't realize this, but feral pigs eat frogs. I think they eat anything they can find. And feral pigs have actually driven these little frogs to extinction. And so not directly caused by humans, but indirectly due to their introduction, humans are responsible. So those are 3 examples. Now, if you don't like these examples, totally cool. There's a billion other examples out there. The dodo bird, dire wolves, mammoths you can use. But it might be a good idea just to have one example in your back pocket, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard a little bit about how they brought the dire wolf back?
Actually, no.
Yeah, so dire wolves are just gigantic wolves, right? Really, really big wolves. And there's a company, I think it's out of California, and they're really determined to bring back mammoths. So they're trying to reconstruct mammoth DNA, and then they're hoping that they can impregnate a African elephant, and the African elephant then can give birth to a mammoth, right?
Wow.
Yeah, right. And so, as part of this process, as part of this ongoing saga, they've started smaller. And dire wolves, they were able to find enough of their DNA intact that they've been able to successfully bring back dire wolves. Dire wolves are also featured in this show called Game of Thrones. So that might be why it's so popular. But this company also wants to bring back this bird called the dodo bird, which was hunted to extinction. They want to bring back this thing called the Tasmanian tiger, which is a marsupial tiger that lived in Tasmania. They want to bring back, you name it. They want to bring back anything they possibly can. And it's wild because they're valued at like multiple billions of dollars, and they have all of these investors like Tom Brady and all these billionaires. So I don't know what the advantages is of this whole process, but people are working on it. All right. So you feel comfortable with what causes anthropogenic extinction and some examples of animals that have been impacted by it? You all good there?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So I think we're going to just transition a little bit. And we talked about how ecosystem diversity is a type of biodiversity, and it's much scarier. It's much more problematic because we're eliminating the place where multiple species live, and that's going to lead to a more aggressive loss or a more aggressive extinction. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, and then I'll give you a couple examples. So again, most of these are self-explanatory. You don't need to commit all 8 to memory, but having 3 to 4 in the back of your mind would be beneficial if you were to encounter this as a short to long answer. So we got to feed people, and so agriculture and the transition of wildlands to agricultural areas is one of the big causes of ecosystem loss. There's hope, though. There's hope because we always want to make this positive, right? And vertical farming represents that hope. Do you know what I mean by vertical farming?
No.
So a lot of farming has become industrialized in terms of not using soil, but rather using hydroponics. And so around Switzerland and around Italy, there's actually quite a few vertical farms. You know the auto stops in Italy that you stop by on the side of the highway?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, what are they called? They're called like auto grills or something. But they're restaurants along the highway in Italy. The reason why I bring those up is they're like a national chain all over Italy, but all of their produce and a lot of their fish comes from vertical farming. And so they have giant warehouses, usually relatively close to these stops along the highway, where they are using water, hydroponics, and fertilizers to grow plants without soil. And rather than having a huge footprint in many, many acres, many square kilometers to grow these crops, they're growing these crops up. So they have multiple stories in these buildings. And maybe one story, they're just growing strawberries, right? And so they're using grow lamps, they're using water. And the nutrients oftentimes are coming from large fish tanks where they're growing tilapia, tuna, and salmon. So they don't even need to go out and buy fertilizer. They can use the nitrogen provided by the fish when they poop or whatever. And so that's hopeful for us. It's hopeful for us for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's a more efficient way to grow crops. So you can grow any kind of vegetable at a much higher success rate, and you can grow it faster. Um, Number two, it doesn't take as much land. Number three, when I finish collecting all those crops, I don't have to necessarily ship them across the country. I can set up a vertical farm right next to my grocery store and then just walk next door. So places like Paris, places like Detroit, big cities, that have kind of areas of that big city that are no longer being utilized are now being transitioned into vertical farms. So we're growing food right in cities where people live. And so that cuts down on transport, and transport cuts down on emissions, and emissions then help reduce climate change. So keep an eye on vertical farming, but I would guess by the time you're my age, the vast majority of produce that you see in grocery stores will come out of vertical farms. What's the bad part about vertical farms? They're super energy intensive. And so they really tap into the electrical grid. And they're getting out competed by data centers. So a lot of data centers now are popping up all over the place with AI, and and they're taking a lot of energy. And so really what these vertical farms are doing is they're investing in solar panels. And so can they utilize solar energy to take care of those energy needs as well? Let's see, urbanization, that's pretty self-explanatory. Cities are growing. Overexploitation, we talked about that. A lot of these are comparable to or the same as the causes of anthropogenic climate change. We've got mining and smelting. Um, that died down for a while, but now with this resurgence of mining for precious elements like lithium and the stuff that we use in microchips, the stuff we use in batteries, we're seeing now an increase in mining and smelting. Diversion of water for agriculture. Like California is, there's part of California that is a huge agricultural producer, but the irony is that it's basically a desert. And so all of the water that this fertile valley in California uses to grow their crops, it's all coming from the Colorado River. And so now by the time the Colorado River flows into the Rio Grande, it's pretty much run dry because so much of the water is being diverted to grow crops in areas where there really shouldn't be crops in the first place. And so again, that really gets back to vertical farming. How can we use better judgment and grow crops in more sustainable and intelligent ways? Fertilizers, another big one. And so I live on a lake here in Wisconsin. I don't know if you guys live right on the water in Tampa, but a lot of my neighbors have these pristine lawns that run right down to the lake. And they've removed, you're supposed to not cut down any wild vegetation within 10 meters of the lake, but they've removed that and put in these grass lawns. And then to maintain these grass lawns, they use fertilizer, but that fertilizer then runs into the lake and it causes these huge explosions in algae and milfoil that cover the surface of the lake, and they basically choke all the oxygen out and they kill all the fish. So there's a battle, at least on my lake right now, to get all the people that have turned their properties, their lawns into these pristine grass lawns back into kind of wild vegetation, but it's not going very well. And then climate change is the last one. All right, did you get all 8 of these?
Yes.
All right. I'm talking a lot. You're doing so good, but the good news is we're moving right along. We're more than halfway done, okay? And so when we talk about ecosystem loss, you can come up with any example you like. Any example. Because when I'm looking at a mark scheme as a moderator, I'm never seeing on the mark scheme this student needs to know about, in this case, Celio Falls. I'm never seeing that. I'm just seeing the student provided a credible example. And so then what I have to always do is I just Google whether or not the example that they provided is an actual example. And so I'm giving you options, but you can come up with any kind of ecosystem loss. And there's billions of them out there. But the two I think of is just the loss of the Southeastern Asian rainforest. And that's just due to population expansion. And so we're seeing this rainforest, which is comparable in terms of species diversity to the Amazon rainforest, but it's getting wiped out as populations in Southeast Asia increase, and those folks want to farm, which is totally understandable, which totally makes sense. And then this other one is kind of closer to my neck of the woods. There was a very famous series of waterfalls in Oregon that were very sacred to the Native American populations that lived there. And they would go to these waterfalls to hunt salmon and to catch salmon when the salmon were spawning, because they were trying to get up the waterfalls, right? And you could stand on these platforms with a spear, and you could basically spear the salmon out of the air as they were trying to make their way up the waterfall, right? But in this particular river, I don't know if it's the Washington River or the Columbia River or something, they put in a huge dam. So they wanted to create electricity. And so they created a reservoir. And in doing so, they flooded these falls. And so these falls now are underwater, under a reservoir. And that really impacted how the salmon were spawning. They put in fish ladders and ways for the salmon and the trout to get upstream, but it definitely had a negative impact on this particular ecosystem and the organisms that live there, as well as it was a huge kind of like infringement on Native American rights, because this is on Native American land. But Americans don't always do so well with respecting Native American land. So those are just 2 examples. You can use any example you want. You don't have to use mine, but I just wanted to give those to you. All right. So how do we know? You good? You want to take a break or anything? You all right?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. So how do we know how bad biodiversity loss is. How do we know if it's accelerating? How do we know if it's getting better? How do we know if it's getting worse? How do we know where it's happening? Well, we have some tools, and one of the tools is a mouthful. It is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES. And this is their sole mission. They're sponsored in part by the UN, United Nations, so they're not affiliated with any particular national government, and that's a good thing, right? Because they're not pressured by lobbyists. They're not under the influence of any kind of a business or any kind of a government, right? They're just collecting data and trying to be as objective as possible in their presentation of this data as they can. And so we rely really, in terms of all the resources, we rely on IPBES the most to really help us understand what's going on in terms of our biodiversity. The negative is, since they aren't affiliated with any kind of government, governments don't have to listen to them, right? And so, there's a lot of really good information here, but a lot of it sadly gets ignored. And IPBES relies to get its data on volunteers. And so if you take an ecology class, for example, in college, oftentimes as part of that class, you'll do 2 or 3 field trips in which you'll collect biodiversity data for this organization. So I recall, like, one of my last classes in college as a senior, I took a bird watching class. I thought, oh my goodness, it's spring. I'm a senior in college. What could be easier than taking this bird watching class? I met from 11 to 1, 3 times a week. I'll get up, I'll grab my binoculars, we'll walk around the woods. It'll be super chill, easy A, right? It was the most difficult class I took. It was more difficult than any genetics class and more difficult than any molecular biology class. And we worked, man. We went on 3 different field trips. One, we counted blue herons, which are these big kind of water birds. Another, we counted eagles. And then the third one, I don't know what we did. I don't remember. But man, they put us to work. But all of the information that we collected was going to the IPBES. So it was for good. So here's some of the information that volunteers might be asked to collect to help inform our biodiversity understanding. And so that could be population size, range, diversity, richness and evenness, which we talked about, area, how degraded it is, and the number of threatened species. And I think all of these correlate to these bullet points here under A4.2. Were you able to get that down?
Yeah.
Perfect. It's kind of cool. I don't know if this is cool or kind of weird, but on the lake that I live on, what they do is they'll come by and they'll put all these electrical lines in the water next to the boat. Have you ever seen this before?
No.
And then they hit a switch and it electrifies the water and it electrocutes all of the fish in a particular area. And so all the fish are stunned and they float up to the top and then they count all the fish. And then after, I don't know, 5 minutes, the fish wake up and then they go about their life. But that happens here a couple times a year. And I always think that's so weird, and also, how do they not electrocute themselves? But that's, if you're interested in that, that's something you can volunteer to help with, which seems kind of funny to me.
Electrocuting fish.
Electrocuting fish, yeah. Now, the key here is that you can't just do this once. The value really comes in just continuously or repeatedly collecting this information. And so they're always looking for people to come out and help. They're always looking for people to continue to gather this data. And fortunately, at least in America, we've got a lot of retired folks. And so around where I live, there a lot of folks do this just as a hobby or whatever. However, you are relying on just, your grandma and grandpa. And so there's just a little nature of science here. Sometimes mistakes happen. But at this point, I feel like the protocols and the equipments and all of the different tools that they use are so advanced that that's not a huge concern anymore. All right, it's math time. Are you ready for a little math?
Not really.
Okay. So good news. The good news is that the IB has just introduced a data booklet for biology. Did you hear this at all?
No.
Yeah, so it's kind of nice. And I have a copy of that data booklet, and I'll show it to you guys in August. But I believe you might be the first cohort to be able to use it. And if I'm wrong, I'm so sorry. But the cohort after you then would get a chance to use it. But in this data booklet is this equation, the Simpson's diversity index. And I can tell you that my expectation is not for you to memorize this equation. It'll be provided for you on a test. And even if we don't have a data booklet, and I just want you to know how to use it. Okay. And so let's get into the Simpson's diversity index. And so what we're calculating here is D, and that's our diversity index. And it's a meaningless number, right? It's just something that you generate, and the only way that it makes sense is in terms of comparison. And so unless I'm comparing a value, a D value, to another D value taken from the same area, whether that's 6 months in the future, a year in the future, a week in the future, there's really no value in this D value. So it's a comparative value. Okay. And so some other symbols in here that are a little confusing is you've got a capital N. Okay. And that's going to be the total number of all organisms, regardless of what species there are. So if I've got 10 different species and each one of those species has 10 individuals, my capital N value is going to be 100, right? That's the total number of organisms of all species. That's what the big N stands for. And then the little n is the number of organisms of a single species. So for example, if I have one species that has, seven individuals, then my little n number is 7. Okay. And then we've got our friend, the sigma, which kind of looks like a big E. And that's just telling me that I need to perform this for every species I have. So I might have a species that has 7 individuals. I might have a species that has 17. I might have another one that has 13. I go ahead and I do this little equation, 17 times 16 or 13 times 12 or 7 times 6. And then I add all those values up. And if this is confusing, don't fret. We're going to do a worked example together. Don't worry. And again, you do not need to memorize this. This is just solely here for you to use, and you just need to know what the symbols mean. A higher value of D tells me that there is more evenness and richness. So there's more biodiversity in a particular area. So I want high values for my capital D. I want high D values. Now, when I worked in Brazil prior to coming to Switzerland, it was difficult for us to get off campus. And so what we would do is there was a parking garage, and on one half of the parking garage, all the teachers parked, right? And on the other half of the parking garage, all of the parents parked. And so what I would have the kids do is I would have the kids do a Simpson's diversity index for the teacher side. So I'd have them calculate D, and then I'd have them calculate D for the parent side. And I wanted to see which parking lot, the teacher parking lot or the parent parking lot, was more diverse. And so which side had a higher number of different brands of cars, and then how many of those different brands of cars did we see? And so you probably can guess, but on the teacher side, we saw lots of, Toyotas and Fords and whatnot, and there were high numbers of those. A teacher would buy a Fiat, and there'd be 8 other teachers who drove Fiats, right? It's an economical, reliable car. And then on the parent side, we saw a much wider variety of cars. We saw Ferraris, we saw Lamborghinis, we saw your BMWs, we saw your Mercedes, but there was usually only 1 or 2 of those cars. So the faculty side was always more biodiverse than the parent side. So that was just one way that we used it. So let's look. Okay, here we go. So we've got this image that we saw earlier. And very quickly, let's fill in the blanks here. So species A, we're going to say is the monarchs. How many monarchs do we have there?
Monarchs, that's butterflies.
Mm-hmm.
6.
The orange. You got 6 of those. Okay. And then how many ladybugs?
1.
1. And then how many dragonflies?
1.
1. Okay. And so 6 plus 1 plus 1 feels like it's 8 to me. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Yes. Still got it. So I know right off the bat that my capital N is going to be 8. Okay. Because that's the total number of organisms I've got here. So I can just I'll file that away in the back of my head. 8. Okay. Then over here, how many ants do I got?
4.
4, yep. And then I got 4 of these. This is a different type of butterfly. I don't know what type of butterfly it is. And so guess what? My capital N on this side is 8 as well. Okay. So let's check this. Yes, we did it. Math. That's what I'm talking about. Who's your math teacher? Do you have
Miss Nyson.
Miss Nyson? Nice. Oh, so you're in the fancy math.
Yeah.
Oh, fancy math. Oh my goodness. All right, so we've got those numbers. We're all good there? And
Yep.
I don't know if you want to fill this in your notes or if it doesn't make a difference. But it's there for you if you want to. Okay. So then what I would do is I would plug these numbers in. So up here where it says capital N, I know that capital N is going to be 8. Okay. So here's 8. And then here it's asking me to take my 8, my capital N, 8, and subtract 1 from it. And so what I'm going to end up with is 8 times 7. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's 56. So I'm just going to remember that up here on top is going to be 56. And then down here, it's a bit trickier. So here, I'm going to start with species A, and I'm going to go 6 times 6 minus 1. So that feels to me like 6 times 6 minus 1 is 5, so that's going to be 30, okay? But I'm not done yet, so that's my first one, 30. The next one for B is going to be easy because 1 times 0 is 0, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I got 30 plus 0, and then plus 0 again. And so if I add all those up, if I sum those up, 30 plus 0 is 0, or it's 30, excuse me. And then up here I had 56. And so to calculate my D value, I'm basically just taking 56 and I'm dividing it by 30. Does that make sense? Did I do that too fast?
No, it's good.
Okay. And so that's my value. Did I do that? 8 times 8 by 1, 56, 30 plus 0, 56 divided by 30, 1.9. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything, right? It's just a value, and it's only used for comparison. And so the second thing I'm going to do now is run the Simpsons diversity index through my sample B. And so for sample B, I've got 8 again. So I know that my capital N over here is going to be 8. So 8 times 8 minus 1 is going to be 56. So I still have that same number up there. But things are going to get a little funkier down here below. So I'm going to do, looks like 4 times 3 plus 4 times 3. So 12 plus 12. That's going to give me 24. So I'll just go a little bit slower, but this is what I just mentioned down here in the corner. I got 8 times 7, 56. Then down here, I got 4 times 3 times 4 times 3. And then I got, in the end, 56 times 24. And so my D value is going to be 2.3. So this is what's so interesting about biodiversity, but it makes sense. The D value for this sample B is higher. It's more biodiverse because it has greater evenness, right? So it's got more individuals. What good is it if I've got higher richness if those folks only have one organism that they can reproduce with? That doesn't do me any favors, right? And so this is the more diverse sample, this sample B, and that's going to give me an index of 2.3. And so I can use that information and say, okay, this particular area was more biodiverse than the other area. And this is just a tool that we use that you're expected to know how to use. Does that kind of make sense?
Yep.
Yep. And so again, do you need to memorize the equation? Heck no. Absolutely not. You just need to know what the values represent and how to plug it in. That's it. All right. We are almost there, kiddo. You are doing so well. You're such a trooper. We're just going to talk a little bit more about anthropogenic extinction, and then we'll talk about the EDGE program, and then you will be free to enjoy the rest of your Sunday as you see fit. Any big plans today? What are you going to do?
I think there was a good deal for some clothes that I might buy because it was 4th of July yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
I'm gonna call my friend from Denmark that I haven't talked with in a while.
Awesome. What did you guys end up doing for the 4th of July? Did you go see some fireworks?
Yeah, there was actually a lot of fireworks because our neighbor set them off, so it was pretty loud.
There you go.
But there wasn't a lot of people outside, like in the malls and everything.
Do you have pets or no?
Yes, but they're not here in America.
Okay. So they weren't affected by the fireworks or anything.
No.
My dog slept on my chest last night and was just panting the entire night. It was not a very restful night's sleep because as all dogs are, she was terrified. And every single person on this lake has fireworks and lit them off till like 4 a.m. So it was kind of chaotic. What are you gonna do? I think the further north you go, the more people get into fireworks.
Yeah.
True. All right. So the biggest issue with biodiversity in terms of humans is just our population. So we're over 8 billion, well over 8 billion now. The good news is it's plateauing. We're starting to see a transition into a kind of a S curve. So, we had exponential growth. If you think of an S, we had exponential growth, and now it's starting to
Plateau.
plateau. That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you. And that's due to a lot of different factors. A lot of it is tied into infant mortality. So if you think about, a family that maybe is relying on agriculture, they're having children, and a lot of the reason why they're having children is to have extra hands on their farm. And if you don't necessarily know if your children are going to survive, you're going to continue to have as many children as you can. And so we see in areas of the world where we've really tried to help out with infant mortality and bring the infant mortality rate down, we've seen mothers choose to have fewer and fewer children. And that's a great thing, right? North America has, I think, just entered into a negative birth rate for the first time in history. Denmark, I'm pretty sure Denmark's already in a negative birth rate. All the Northern European, Sweden, Norway, Finland, they're all negative. Japan's negative. Most of Western Europe's negative. increasingly, like Africa is still very positive. So across the equator, especially, we're still seeing very high birth rates, but those are coming down. But yeah, it's plateauing, but 8 billion people is still a heck of a lot of people, right? If you're interested in human population growth, there's a really cool website called Gapminder, and it was started by a really famous award-winning Swedish economist. I think his name is Hans Rosling, and he passed away. But it's a really cool thing to mess around with. Again, it's called Gapminder, and it really shows you which countries are growing and the rate at which they're growing and what factors contribute to their growth and whether or not they're slowing down. Like places like China have slowed down immensely. And I think India will surpass China here in terms of population, but they're slowing down as well. So that's a good thing. It's a good thing. Um, Again, this feels redundant, but with human population growth, right, you see all of these things that we just keep talking about over and over again: urbanization, over harvesting, pollution, disease, all that good stuff. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the difference between ex situ and in situ. So I feel like in Thailand, you probably experienced a little bit of both, right? So they were in situ conserving in terms of trying to maintain the elephants' habitats and create corridors, if I'm not mistaken. I feel like that's the goal of the
Yeah.
group you worked with. But I'm sure there are some instances where that particular organization is also doing ex situ conservation, where they're finding elephants that have been injured, or maybe had too much human contact, or whatnot, and they're finding habitats and they're finding sanctuaries for those elephants as well. So you probably know more about this than I do. So again, in situ is when we're trying to protect the ecosystem, when we're trying to protect the habitat, right? So in America, we've got national parks, we've got state parks, we've got preserves, we've got forest land, but we're trying to prohibit industrialization and urbanization. And this is the best option, right? Let's not mess with the animals. No, let's not take them away from their native habitats. Let's keep them where they are, and let's just try to protect their way of life. But those habitats require a lot of work, right? Because they're not in a bubble, and they're still going to experience human interaction and human involvement. And so one of the biggest things that we look at is how can we really inhibit alien species or invasive species from making their way into these habitats. And so again, it's going to rely heavily on volunteers. It's going to rely heavily on government agencies like the Department of Natural Resources or the Parks Department. But even though we protected this chunk of land, we still have humans, having an influence on it. At the same time, we can introduce species that have maybe fallen in numbers, and so we see that a lot with trees and vegetation, where we're removing invasive species, but then we're also replanting native species in hopes of regenerating ecosystems. But here's the bad part, right? Climate change is impacting ecosystems. So the ecosystem that was there may not necessarily be the ecosystem that will be there in 10, 20, 30 years because of climate change. And so the National Park Service here in the US has a really cool program where they take plants and animals from one national park and they try to figure out how the ecosystems have changed. And then they bring those animals to other national parks that might have a more similar kind of climate to what those organisms experienced before climate change. We always want to prevent poaching. Poaching obviously is not as big of an issue here in the United States. It's still an issue, but in Africa, for example, you'll see efforts to curb poaching that are really extreme, where you have armed guards surrounding rhinos. And then they're also clever in that they'll often introduce hunting and they'll grant hunting and then they'll use the profits from those hunts to better protect species and inhibit poaching as well. So this is all about maintenance, rewilding, reclamating. And then maybe what we're more familiar with is ex situ. And so anytime you've been to a zoo, anytime you've been to a botanical garden, anytime you've been to a seed bank, anytime you've been to, a preserve, that's ex situ conservation. So we've got an organism, the best way we can do to support that organism or increase awareness or education is by taking that organism out of its natural habitat and then putting it into some sort of preserve and caring for it to the best of our abilities. I don't know if you've heard the statistic that there's more big cats in the state of Texas on preserves than there are in the wild. And so there are some really passionate people out there who are really trying to protect these organisms. But ideally, we still really want to rely on in situ conservation as opposed to ex situ. This is a very, very famous seed bank in Norway, the Ark, and this has just tons and tons and tons and tons of different seeds that have been preserved, which is really neat. And then I think the very last thing we're going to talk about today, and you've been so patient and we're running over time here, sorry about that, is just the edge of existence program. And so oftentimes we have to make calculated choices in terms of what organisms that we want to protect, just due to funding or due to, government laws or anything that might be proved problematic or tricky in protecting these organisms. So oftentimes what we'll look for is something called a flagship species. It's a species that's charismatic. It's a species that's cute. It's a species that people like. And we'll use those charismatic or those cute species, knowing that with the money that we bring in, we can also divert some of that funding to protecting less charismatic or less attractive species. And so koalas, pandas, tigers, all these kind of big mammals with big eyes, they're all very appealing to people. And so we'll really pour in a ton of money and effort and energy into protecting these organisms. But at the same time, we're also protecting the slugs and the snakes and the insects that also occupy these same habitats and are also threatened as well. And so one of the programs that really works hard to do this is the EDGE program. So they evaluate threatened species that are usually highly specialized. So you know all about koalas, right? What do koalas eat?
Plants.
Mm-hmm. And they eat a particular type of plant called the eucalyptus. And eucalyptus has some medicinal properties, but for the most part, it's toxic to the extent that eating eucalyptus for millions of years has really inhibited koalas' brain development. So koalas are not very bright. They're actually kind of limited. And if you take a eucalyptus leaf, for example, and you put it on a plate, a koala can't recognize it as a eucalyptus leaf. It needs to be, on the tree itself. And so because of the fact that they only eat one type of plants, koalas are very, very, very threatened. In addition, their habitat, which is eucalyptus trees, eucalyptus trees create an oil that's highly flammable. And so as climate change creates problems with drought in Australia, many of these eucalyptus forests are burning, and these poor koalas are being roasted right on the trees. And so the EDGE program looked at koalas and looked at sloths. And while they're both threatened, while they're both endangered, koalas, they felt like, were more risky, and that they're also more beloved by people. And so they could generate more attention by focusing on koalas. But those are the kind of choices that they make when they're trying to support different organisms. But again, it's subjective, right? So it's always very, very controversial. Some other things that they can look at is, do they have other close relatives, or are they really genetically unique? So being a marsupial, a koala is pretty genetically unique. So that's another reason to want to protect it. Whereas there's quite a few species, not quite a few, but there's a number of species of sloths. And so they're not quite as unique. And EDGE itself stands for evolutionary distinct and globally endangered. All right, boss. So just to go back to the start, because this was a lot of talking on my part, and I apologize for that. But what do you really want to take away? What do you really want to focus in on? And again, if you can say to yourself, I know the difference between ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity, if you feel comfortable with that, boom, that's probably the biggest point made in this particular section. And then if you understand the Simpsons diversity index and how it relates to richness and evenness and how those are different, that's the second big point. And then if you can understand what anthropogenic extinction is and what are some of the factors that are causing anthropogenic extinction, whether that's due to species or ecosystem loss, then you're golden. And then if you know the difference between in situ and ex situ conservation, boom. And then finally, if you know a little bit about IPBES and the EDGE program, boom. Those are the big things to focus on in this particular unit. How does that feel? Is that